Hey there, crew. Thanks for joining us for another NAWC Live C Groups. Today, we're going to do a summary and review of Stile's book, Evangelism. I hope you've enjoyed this study as much as I have. I know I've walked away from Stiles with a lot of practical advice and honestly just some conviction about improving in the area of evangelism within my own life. As I said, this will be our last study in that series. So stay tuned to youth communications, the Facebook page, the emails, the text messages, the website. Check those things out for just updates on what things will look like going forward. But for today, let's go ahead and just jump into Stile's book, Evangelism, for one last go round. To begin with, in chapter 1, Stiles starts by just laying a groundwork by giving definitions of key concepts like evangelism and the gospel. And what he sets forth, I think, are very helpful definitions. So he defines evangelism as teaching the gospel with an aim to persuade. That is, telling people what the gospel is with the hopes of getting them to believe it's true. And that was very close to the definition I like, which is attempting to guide someone into the kingdom. And the reason I like that definition is because it makes clear, at least in my mind, that a whole range of activities counts as evangelism. That it's not just the act of sharing the gospel, but it's all the work you do before and after that as well. Everything from reaching out to an unbelieving neighbor by just saying hey, to inviting them to church, to anything in that spectrum that you do as a way of bringing them into the kingdom of God. And so that was evangelism. The other key definition was, what is the gospel? And Stiles defined the gospel as the joyful message from God that leads us to salvation. And I think one way to unpack that is to say that the gospel is the good news that God is willing to be reconciled. That God is ready to reach out to sinful human beings and be reconciled in his relationship with them. And then Stiles turned at that point and gave us a really helpful way of thinking about how to present the gospel. And it's actually the way that we used to use in our evangelism skill lessons to present the gospel as the answer to 4 questions. Who is God? Who are we? What have we done, or what has God done, and what can we do in response? So, if you're interested in learning more about that approach, I would go and check out the PDF on the website for the very first C group lesson in this series. So that was chapter 1. When we moved to chapter 2, Stiles started to talk about cultivating a culture of evangelism. So now we have a better idea of what evangelism is and what the gospel is. How do we create a culture of it? And by culture, all he meant was, how do we make evangelism something that we as a church and we as a youth ministry do on a regular basis? And he had some helpful points about why this was important. He noted that evangelism has always been meant to be a group activity, something the whole church does, not just something that certain individuals are doing, and that when you have a culture of evangelism, it actually helps people inside the church to be more motivated to do it in their own lives when they hear about all the stories other people have. And we mentioned a few ways to maybe get that ball rolling at 9th and O. I'll just mention one now, was to really lean into Dr. Cook's 3-part evangelism for 9th and O of interceding, investing, and inviting. To intercede, to begin to pray for somebody that's lost in your life. To invest in your relationship with them, all with the goal of eventually inviting them to the church. We moved past that chapter into, we actually skipped chapter 3 and went to chapter 4. And in chapter 4, Stiles mentions kind of some barriers to the gospel, things that we have to overcome before we can actually begin to make evangelism a regular part of our lives. And he mentioned 6. I'll just mention a couple of them. One was understanding that the gospel-shaped life involves evangelism. In other words, understanding that evangelism is just part of the Christian lifestyle. And just like you can't be a bodybuilder and not go to the gym, you can't be a faithful Christian and not have some kind of evangelism going on in your life. And the second was to see evangelism as a discipline. To recognize that really nobody is born, or very few are born, naturally great at evangelism. Most of us have to learn how to do it better and better over time. And that brought us to the last week's chapter, which I think was the most practical, where Stiles began to talk about how we do evangelism and asked us to think of ourselves as ambassadors for the Lord, as people that are representing the kingdom of God to the kingdom of the world. And here he gave us a couple of practical tips on how to be ambassadors well. One was to think through conversations ahead of time. To not just walk in cold turkey to a meeting or a conversation or an outreach opportunity with an unbeliever, but to have planned out in advance what we want to say to that person as kind of the next step towards bringing them into God's kingdom. And then another point I'll mention that I think was particularly helpful was that we are to deliver the message and trust Jesus with the response. That is, it's not our job at the end of the day to change people's hearts, because we can't do that. All we're called to do is faithfully report the gospel, which is the good news that God is willing to be reconciled, and trust in Jesus to work whatever response he will in that person's heart. So that's Stiles' book, Evangelism, in a nutshell. I'm looking forward to chatting a little bit about it in some of our just C groups with you guys here this coming week. Take care.